Here Comes Pod is having an existential moment from the pages of Hamlet, to be or not to be an audio or video podcast. So where better to turn for help than the Shakespeare of audio, Steve Ackerman. Steve is steeped in audio broadcasting, having started as a radio presenter, journalist, DJ and producer. In 2000, he joined something else and helped to grow the business into one of the UK's leading independent audio and video production companies before it was acquired by Sony Music in 2021. Now back from working in New York at Sony Music, Steve shares his thoughts on the evolution of podcasts, the importance of video to the format, why community is the key to building a commercial model for podcasts, and what David Brent can teach us on how not to lead a team. Enjoy. Hi, Steve. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Danny. Thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. I always like to start with a fun question to get the creative juices flowing. And so my question to you is this one. If you could choose two people from the world of entertainment, and that could be film, TV, music, sport, whatever you choose, and you could choose them to host a podcast, which two people would you choose and what would be the format?
It's such a great question, and I've given this quite a lot of thought. And actually, I think I would choose Pep Guardiola, the Man City manager. I'm not a Man City fan, I should add. And Reed Hastings, who was one of the founders of Netflix. And I just think both of those guys just have proven themselves to have incredible insight around leadership and success and creating really strong sort of winning cultures. I'd love to hear the two of them in conversation about the similarities between what they've done and maybe what they can learn from each other. So yeah, it would be an in conversation podcast between the two of them.
Wow, I was not expecting that, but I think it would be fascinating as well. You started your working life as a radio DJ, journalist, and producer. What inspired you to get into radio as a career, and how did you learn such a diverse range of skills across hosting, producing, and journalism?
I was just obsessed about the radio from when I was about 11 or 12. I literally I'd go to bed, and when it was time to turn the light off, I'd often still have the radio on and just be listening to Laser 558 and Capital late at night. Capital those days was much cooler than Radio 1. And I was just obsessed I just wanted to be part of that. For me, that was just, the place I wanted to be. And that was just my focus from sort of then on. And so the journey in was to be a radio DJ first. And in those days, there were only about, 20 odd commercial radio stations around the country. There really weren't many. Each area had one, apart from London, that had Capital and LBC. And so my route in was to be a DJ and just to pick up work where I could. And I was sort of quite fortunate that when I was still a student at Manchester, Radio 5 started up. And it had a late night youth show that was hosted by Mark Radcliffe. And I managed to get work on that as a features reporter and then build out from that to working on their afternoon show. And so the journalism ran in parallel with the presenting. And then, I sort of got to a point where I realized I wasn't going to get to Radio 1. I could see there were other people who were better than me and probably wanted it a little bit more. And actually the thing that interested me a bit more was the creativity. It wasn't just the sort of, being in front of the mic. It was the creativity, and therefore going down that producer route obviously allowed you a lot more influence over what could happen on a show, and frankly, a lot more time to be able to think about those ideas. So that was the path, really.
January 2000, it's the start of a new millennium, and also the year that you joined something else, an independent audio production company that specialized in producing radio shows for UK radio networks. What was your brief when you joined, and how did your role and the company evolve over time?
Yeah, my brief when I came in, so something else was a small fledgling business, and most of what it was doing for the BBC at that point. I think there were about 8 or 10 staff at that point. And my brief was come in and try and win commercial work, try and win non-BBC work. And so I really had to get out and hustle a bit, really. And over time we did it. The first thing I did in the first week or two, and I wish I had it in this room, I could show it to you, but I think it's upstairs because I've got it framed. Obviously, letters were still a thing then, right? Sending out letters. And pretty much the first thing I did in my first week was I wrote to the people who at that point owned the Pepsi chart show, and they had another production company, Unique, who were making that and had been making it for many years. And I wrote to them and said, we want to picture it. And they said, no, we're very happy with who we've got. And every year I would contact them and say, we want to picture it. We can do a better job. And after about 4 or 5 years, I think 6 years actually. So every year I'd write to them. And on the sixth year, they said, yes, okay, we're going to pitch it. And something else won that contract. But I have that letter from the very first week. I have that framed as pretty much the first thing I ever did at something else.
And then how did your role and the company evolve over the next few years?
Yeah, so I did manage to win work that wasn't BBC work, and we built that out. At the same time, the BBC side expanded, and so the whole radio piece grew quite dramatically, and pretty quickly we became really the leading company for producing shows, across radio, whether that was BBC or commercial radio. We did do that chart show for a number of years, which was a very lucrative job. But you couldn't really scale a business, I think, to the ambition that I had and Jez Nelson, who was one of the founders, and the other directors that we had for the business. And so we started to forage into other areas, and really that was social media in its early, its very early infancy, and digital. Online content was just sort of starting, apps, gaming, that sort of stuff. So we started to sort of develop a lot of work in those sorts of spaces, and became real innovators in a number of spaces. And then over time, there was a small TV bit of the business as well that Jez actually sort of headed up, and that was his baby. So you had these different areas of content running, and in effect, we were a multi-platform content production business, and in fact, we used to describe ourselves like that. And obviously, this was at a time where people didn't really understand what that meant. We'd get folks looking at us, looking a little bit bemused. Well, what do you mean? You make radio shows and you do TV shows and you do social media and online content? And we'd say, yeah, because we think content should live wherever audiences are. So now that I look back at that time, I can actually appreciate even more that I think we were quite, forward looking and future seeking.
When did you first discover podcasts, and what was the first one that you worked on?
Oh wow. Well, I mean, I certainly discovered them pretty much in their infancy when they were first coming around, and obviously in those days, no one was really making money from them. At that point, I was quite a big runner. I was sort of doing marathons and half marathons and that sort of thing. So obviously, podcasts were perfect for those running moments. The first one we worked on, and I'm trying to remember the brand. It was actually a branded podcast. It might have been for Ericsson, but I might have that wrong. And I know an old colleague's going to get in touch with me and tell me, no, it wasn't Ericsson, it was someone else. But it was a brand paid us to make a podcast, and that was the first one that we created. And over time, we occasionally would get podcast jobs. We were definitely evangelists for podcasting, but it was really difficult trying to make the argument about why folks should invest money in podcasting. Even though you could see audiences were sort of coming and people were consuming it, there just wasn't a model at that time.
So one of the more high-profile shows from something else was the Kermode and Mayo film review, which was both a stalwart of the BBC Radio 5 live schedule and also a podcast in the early 2000s, becoming really one of the UK's most popular podcasts. I was a big fan. Some of my letters were read out from time to time, mini reviews. In April 22, the show and the podcast left the BBC to move into the commercial world and became Kermode and Mayo's Take. In the same month, actually, another one of my favorite BBC podcasts, that Peter Crouch show, also left the BBC to become part of the commercial sector. So a big change in the Goldman podcast listening menu. Was it a creative decision for Kermode and Mayo to leave the BBC ecosystem, or a commercial one because the BBC was struggling to compete with commercial offers? And that's why I contextualize that with the Peter Crouch one. Was something going on?
Yeah, it was actually both. I mean, very much creative, because we kept saying to Mark and Simon, if we move away from the BBC, as wonderful a home as the BBC has been, it definitely will free us up creatively, and there'll be a lot more we can do with the show. Every year they do one live show, or in fact, they wouldn't even do it every year. They do it every few years to be a live show. But there was a real limit, sort of what else you could do with the show. And also by that point, obviously 22, we could see where things were commercially that frankly you could make a lot more money doing the podcast and owning the content because obviously it allowed Mark Simon to then own that show in a way that you just couldn't do with the BBC. And certainly at that time, I think it's different now, but at that time the BBC wasn't quite as agile. They hadn't quite grasped the podcast opportunity yet, and so it sort of made it obvious that that was the right moment.
How important was the BBC or has the BBC been in nurturing the UK podcast ecosystem? And also, did you experience challenges in not having that BBC cross-promotional platform that it can offer a podcast so that it can surface it amongst so many different places within the organization?
Yeah, I think the BBC. I don't think it was so important in the earlier days. There were some shows it would release as podcasts, like Kermode and Mayo, but in essence, they were just edits of radio shows, and there wasn't original content that the BBC was doing. It's very different now, of course. Of course, the BBC has fully embraced podcasting now and creates many terrific shows that that sort of add to what's going on. But they weren't that influential in the earlier years, and I think you saw independent companies like us or folks like Muddy Knees Media who were creating successful football shows, or folks like The Guardian or The Times. Lots of those sorts of entities were creating original content for podcasting. But the truth is, really, I think the USA was ahead of us, and and the UK was a bit slow out the starting gates in terms of identifying the opportunity and seeing the full potential. And it took really for that to become a commercial reality in the States for, I think, folks over here to start thinking, well, maybe this could be something where, creatively it can be great, but also you can make some money.
Yeah, well, I was going to come on to talk about the US market, so that's a great segue. Can you compare and contrast the podcast world in the US and the UK? Obviously, the US is a much bigger country. UK is, kind of the size of a big state almost in the US, but still, just structurally and the way that the commercial organizations can really get and dig deep into the podcasting world to extract value.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe for context for anyone sort of watching or listening, I'm just back from living there for sort of 3.5 years, and that did give me just a great insight. I mean, certainly some of the sort of stereotypical points are really true. So you've already said one, which is just scale of market. I mean, it's just incomparable. The sort of size of opportunity in the States compared to the UK. And it does mean that a show that frankly may not be getting huge numbers, 100, 200,000 a week, something like that, can really make very, very good money in the States. So the size of opportunity is definitely different. I think there is greater ambition. You definitely see that. You see that from independent production companies. Now there's a greater ability to raise money. So you see folks, I see folks who come and see me and they say, "Yeah, we're starting up a production company. We've got $5 or $10 million backing," and you'd be like, "Wow, it's sort of quite incredible, really." I think the other thing I really noticed was on the talent side, which is that I think the US has been a lot quicker to identify the opportunity for talent and for celebrities and influencers to own their own content and monetize against that. And you would see folks coming out of like daytime US TV and setting up their own shows that they owned and that they were making very good money from. And frankly, they're not going back to that broadcast ecosystem. We're just starting to see that here. Obviously, Ant and Dec a month or two ago announced they're launching. Folks like Jamie Lang have obviously been owning and creating their own content for a while. But normally the default here has been for a celebrity or a talent to go to someone like Sony Music or the BBC or the Guardian or whoever and say, "Pay me, will you pay me? What are you going to pay me to do a show for you?" As opposed to saying, "I'd like to own my own show and I want you to either invest into it or to be my partner in helping me, launch it." And then I think the final thing I just saw about the States was, and look, I mean, this may not be true of all of the States, but I certainly found it to be true of the folks I was working with and coming into regular contact with in New York, which was, again, the sort of stereotypical point you often hear about US folks. It's just the optimism. It's just the sort of get up and go attitude and the positivity that just says, "Yeah, we can do this." And you just saw that all the time in loads of different scenarios. And frankly, I think the UK has a lot to be proud of creatively as a creative sector. It's a fantastic industry for us. And podcasting and the audio world and business is a fantastic export for us. And I would like folks to puff out their chests a little bit more here and to be a bit more confident and proud in terms of what we do and realize that creatively we're a very strong nation, and that's why we've been so successful across TV and music and radio and every creative medium you can think of. But to bottle that attitude a little bit, I think that's something we really could learn from our American friends.
Is it possible to build a commercial model for podcasts in the UK based on advertising? Or does that model require subscription fees for extra content, ad-free listening, or to have special access to episodes or events?
No, I mean, it's absolutely possible, and there's plenty of people who are doing that now. The advertising market is growing at a really aggressive rate now. We've moved past having lots of direct to market DM brands advertising, those original advertisers, the Squarespace, who are wonderful brands and still welcome in the podcast ecosystem. But you're seeing a lot of blue chip brands advertising now in podcasting. You know, folks like Airbnb are sort of big spenders in podcasting. So no, advertising is still the predominant commercial model, but subscription has become really significant. And I think if you understand how to harness a community and fandom, then subscription can be a really important revenue stream and really important part of the ecosystem.
So in 2021, you kind of touched on this. Something else was acquired by Sony Music Entertainment, and the audio department of the company joined Sony Music's global podcast division, which you headed up alongside your partner, Jez, who you mentioned earlier. What was the impetus for a record company like Sony Music to acquire something else?
Well, I think, I mean, Sony Music had started playing in the podcast space a few years earlier. And we'd actually been a beneficiary of that because they'd done a production deal with us first of all. So they didn't have any ownership in the company, but they did have a production deal around our shows. And I think there were a few drivers, but the main one being that, and these metrics are still consistent now. You can see over time that podcasting has started to infiltrate share of ear. So in other words, the amount of time someone spends listening, some of what was being spent on music has switched to listening to actually to speech, because audiobooks obviously are also part of that equation. And so I think that was the thinking. Probably also, I think the other element was, look, Sony is a super successful business, actually a really fantastic business. I was very privileged to have the chance to work there. And audio is the new entertainment landscape at that point. And so it made sense, obviously, for Sony to be part of that. And I guess Sony Music was the audio bit of the business. So I think that was probably the logic.
And you talked about working and living in New York, but I guess one of the other elements of joining Sony Music Entertainment was you were joining a new corporate culture, and you'd been in a sort of more entrepreneurial, live business. So, how did you find being part of that new corporate culture and that evolution after being so long as an independent?
Well, I think you often hear when one business gets acquired by another, there are plenty of nightmare stories of where cultures don't fit, or where things aren't quite how they seemed before the two companies came together. And there is a plethora of M&A disaster stories like that. And I think for Jez and I, when we were thinking about who we might sell the business to, because we'd had a lot of approaches over a few years, culture was a really important part of that equation. We wanted to ensure that the home we went to would be the right fit for the something else culture, which was something we'd been super proud of and we built up over many years. And even to this day, the I think the sort of warmth and loyalty that a lot of ex something else's feel towards the time they spent in the business is a genuine one because of the culture that we created. People loved working there because they learned a lot. We were super creative, super ambitious. They had loads of fun and they made loads of great friends. And I think it was really important that that culture could carry on. Obviously, it's never going to be quite be the same, but it was important to some degree that culture could carry on. And I think Sony Music were able to deliver that, and that's why it has been a successful coming together. And I was personally very pleased about that because there's a lot of people who'd worked within the business for a long time, and I wanted to feel that it would be a good home for them.
I recently produced my first video podcast, and podcasts have evolved from purely audio entertainment experiences to incorporate video. Should every podcast and indeed radio show have a visual component? And how does that change the experience of the material as well as the commercial model?
Well, I wouldn't say by default every podcast should, because there's clearly some where that just may not be suitable. And I think particularly for limited run narrative shows, it's still potentially a challenge. But certainly, for weekly shows where this sort of dynamic is the component where it's a talk show of sorts, I think you're missing a significant opportunity if you're not now thinking about video. And that's really because, look, the audience demand is there, but also a lot of the research and certainly a lot of the stats I've seen show that video is not cannibalizing audio, it's additive. So, in other words, it's opening up new audiences. And therefore, it's sort of back to what I was saying a bit earlier about something else's early days and our multi platform approach and the idea that you just create content for wherever audiences are going to be. And, it shouldn't be about creating the content to suit the content's needs, it should be about creating the content to suit the audience's needs. And if the audience shows that there's a demand or a hunger to consume what was an audio format in video as well, then I sort of struggle to understand why you wouldn't want to embrace that, particularly now that it doesn't cost a lot to be able to create that video version. There's plenty of tools you can use, as indeed you are doing now. And so, I do think when you're starting a show now, you've got to be pretty crazy if you're not really thinking about the video side of things. Look, I mean, in terms of how it changes it, I think it does add an extra dimension, predominantly for the host, in terms of just being cognizant of the audience. I've definitely seen and heard a number of podcasts recently, or I've certainly listened to a few shows from high profile folks where they're just not being cognizant of the fact that a big chunk of the audience are going to be listening. And therefore you just miss out on jokes or you miss out on what's going on in the studio because they're not describing to you. They're not doing that classic radio thing of drawing with pictures and and explaining to the audience, which even if the thing's being filmed, you've got to do because you've got to understand there are two audiences coming to this piece of content.
Apple really supercharged podcasting globally, and they've just enabled video for podcasts. How will that change the economics of podcasting, do you think?
I think it's really significant. I'm personally really excited about what Apple have announced for a few reasons. I think the sort of biggest element is the fact that they're going to allow dynamic ad insertion, which basically means your ad can be dropped into your video. And at a later date, if you want to take the ad out, if it's only going to run for a couple of months, you can then drop another ad in. That's very different currently from what YouTube allow, where if I'm sending my own advertising into the video, it has to be what's called baked in. So in other words, it's fixed within the video for the entire life of that video. And Spotify, who don't allow that, well, who allow baked in as well, but don't allow dynamic ad insertion. And in fact, if you're going to run video on Spotify, you sort of have to sacrifice some of your audio ad money around that. And so I do think this is a really significant move, because I think YouTube have announced they're going to be doing the same thing. They just haven't announced when. So hopefully that will accelerate them getting their plans in place and that coming later this year. And that, of course, means if YouTube are allowing it and Apple are allowing it, it would be very interesting to then see what Spotify do and whether that's something that comes into play for Spotify. I think the other sort of interesting thing from in terms of Apple is, as ever, their design is really carefully thought through. I haven't had a chance to play with the beta yet, but I have read reviews from folks who have. And for anyone watching or listening to this podcast, I'd really recommend going and reading up James Cridland's assessment, who's done a very good, thorough assessment of what it offers. And I think from a user experience, I think it's going to be a really, really good experience. I do know that you can be watching on video, and if you put it in your pocket, it will automatically switch to audio. So little things like that again just play to the audience, because we do know that there are plenty of people who are not fixed on either video or audio. Again, it's back to do what suits the audience, right? And there's plenty of people who might consume a podcast initially on video and then pick it up later in audio, or vice versa. So I think it's a really exciting move, and also it just fills me with optimism in the sense of it's 2026, and there's still exciting things happening in this space. And it sort of confirms as well what a baby industry it is. You know, it's still developing all the time, and people sort of forget that, particularly if they're a bit critical about the podcast space compared to TV or radio or movies or music. This is a really new bit of the entertainment ecosystem. So it's fantastic to see that innovation still happening. And I absolutely applaud Apple for this. I think it's a really fantastic move.
Our experience of audio is changing. You just touched on that, really, and so is the traditional video world. How does the evolution of video delivered via social media, how does that affect the way content is produced, the stories that are told, and the skills required to tell them?
Well, social media, clips are just super important, obviously, from a marketing perspective. I think most podcast producers would say to you they're not so important from a revenue perspective, but they are really important. Of course, they are. Back to again, audiences and go where audiences are, right? So they, they're again part of the ecosystem. I mean, at this point in time, there's just a whole bunch of great tools that you can use to ensure that social can be part of what you do. There's now a growing body of AI tools as well. I know Opus is one that's used by quite a number of people and just allows you to produce a whole bunch of social clips around your content. And it's sort of back to what we were just discussing around the video side, which is once you're filming your show, why wouldn't you be slicing and dicing it to sit on every sort of platform? And particularly if there are tools that help you to do that in a quicker way, particularly if you're a small podcaster or you're operating within a small team, then at the moment it's super accessible to be able to do that. And so having that strategy where you think about the social side as the marketing outlet, the YouTube side for discovery and revenue, and the audio side as a revenue play and for loyalty and fandom, that's, I think, the mindset you should be having across those three different areas.
From a producer perspective, what's the difference between producing content for an audience and a community? You touched on community. And does that change the way that content should be created?
That's a great question, actually. I think that absolutely gets to the heart of why podcasting has had the results it's had. Because ultimately, if a show really works, it's not about audiences, it's about community and fandom, which are words I've obviously used, a bit earlier in the podcast. Podcasting allows you to develop a habit with an audience. I mean, ultimately, what are you trying to do with your show, right? You're trying to win some people to come and listen to the show or watch the show, and you're aiming and hoping that the content will be strong enough that they'll come back episode after episode after episode. And if that happens, not only do they come back, they tell one or two people, and hopefully over time your audience grows and your revenues grow and the loyalty grows. And if you have the sort of show where that loyalty is really deep, then yes, it starts to become more than just audiences, it becomes community and fandom. And what that then unlocks for you is additional opportunities, because of course then subscription becomes something that can be a really important part of the play. If you can get to a big enough scale, live can become, something that's opened up. I've seen shows that don't have huge numbers but have huge loyalty, where merch is a really important part because people do want to buy the t-shirt or the hoodie or the mug or whatever it might be. So, that ability to sort of super serve an audience is I think at the heart of the podcast culture, and is where podcasting has proven really different, particularly to sort of the broadcast medium in terms of radio and TV that just don't have that same loyalty from audiences.
So you've been a leader operating in both the UK and the US, leading and managing large teams. How have you got the best out of people? And what did you, as well as Ricky Gervais, learn from the management techniques of David Brent?
Ha. Well, funnily enough, I think me and Ricky Gervais did work for someone who was partly based on the character of David Brent, but I don't think we should name that person. Uh, my focus as a leader was a few things. It was always about, do people understand the direction of travel? Can we lay down a clear strategy that everyone can understand and everyone can push in the right direction towards? And I think that was always really important. The second thing was momentum. I always thought momentum was like a super important part of how you try and get somewhere, creating timelines and deadlines to aim for, or something, some point in the future to aim for, some target to aim for. But I always felt people did their best work if they really enjoyed what they were doing, and if they had a sense of purpose and a sense of journey and a sense of camaraderie. I think that was really important. And I would hope that most people who worked with or for me would say that part of that experience was about being part of a great team. I always felt it was about the team. I was always very upset with people who weren't team players. Everyone has ego to some extent, but the ego can't dominate the team. The team has to come first. And I guess that goes back to where we started, why I would be fascinated to hear from someone like Pep Guardiola, right? It's not just that he's a master tactician. He understands that concept of how you build a team. And at times you have to rebuild the team. You have to keep raising the standard. So I think that was my approach in terms of what I learned. What I learned from the David Brent character, actually, and I'm sure most people would probably agree with this. I think you learn more from the people who are not good leaders and managers sometimes than you do from really good people you work for. And certainly with that character, I learned a lot about how not to lead and manage people, which was definitely very helpful for me.
On a similar theme, I suppose, the kind of the inverse experience, it said that we learn more in failure than success. So if you could pick one project you worked on that didn't work out, but you learned a lot from, which one would that be?
Cool, that's a tough one. I'm not sure if I'd be able to identify one single project, but I would certainly be able to identify some common experiences that happened across projects. I think often, particularly early on the Something Else journey, we were very focused on delivering for the client because we wanted to renew business, and that was certainly how we built business. But I think at times that was certainly at the expense of keeping a keen eye on things commercially. We'd sort of over deliver to a slightly crazy extent. And in later years, as we started to get a better understanding of that, I think the business ran more effectively. I think identifying, being quicker to identify clients or people on the other side of the table who are not good people to work with. I mean, thankfully, the vast, vast, vast majority of people that I had the pleasure of working with, or my teams had the pleasure of working with in the Something Else days, were good people to work with and for. But very occasionally you get someone who wasn't. And I think the temptation, particularly when you're a smaller business, is to sort of try and ride it out. And yet that has such damage for the folks who are working on that project. And ultimately always leads to the same place anyway, which is you just can't carry on like that. So I think having the sort of strength and foresight and confidence to get out of some of those bad situations quicker is something you learn over time, and something I think, with one or two early experiences, probably didn't do.
So what's next for Steve Ackerman?
Well, next is, I only finished working for Sony Music at the end of last year, and so I've had a little break, which has been lovely, and now I'm working with a bunch of businesses. Look, I mean, I've had 30 years, right, of sort of leading and managing teams. I've had the US and UK thing, and a lot of experience across different forms of content, and I'm really still driven by businesses who are on that journey and are trying to grow and ultimately get to a point where probably they can exit. And so I'm working with a bunch of businesses across the creative industries in that space, either as a non-exec where it's a longer term commitment, or as a consultant where I'm just being brought in on a shorter term question that the leadership team might have. So that's what I'm up to.
Finally, if you found yourself alone on a desert island with access to a digital device that had access to one podcast, one audiobook, one music album, and one radio station for 2 hours a day, which podcast, audiobook, album, and radio show would you choose to keep you company?
It's a great question. I obviously had to give this a bit of thought because you very kindly, this was one question you did warn me would come. So the podcast would be one that is not, I don't think, massive in the UK, but is a very big podcast in the US called Pivot, which is Scott Galloway and Cara Swisher. And I think if you're into media and entertainment and tech, with a bit of politics thrown in as well, it's just a great insight. Cara Swisher is a very, very knowledgeable and experienced tech journalist, very well connected in Silicon Valley. Scott Galloway is a hugely experienced and successful business person and understands how businesses operate, but also brings more to it as well now. Things like toxic masculinity, he's written books on, and he's now leading a campaign about people giving up their subscriptions as a sign of protest against some of the Silicon Valley folks and how they're backing the current president. So anyway, that show is absolutely brilliant. So that would be the podcast. The audio book would be Philip Pullman's Dark Materials, which is my favorite book of all time. It does mean I get a trilogy as well. And if I really want to cheat, there was a second trilogy, so it gives me lots of listening time. But that's just an amazing book that ostensibly is a children's book, but is really about how important knowledge is and how pernicious organized religion can be, and is just magical and just beautiful. Has stayed with me for many years. The album would be Jill Scott, Words and Sounds, Volume One, Jill Scott, which is Jill Scott's first album. If anyone hasn't heard it, go and listen like now. It's perfection. It's about 20 odd years old now. She's just got a new album out, but she is the queen as far as I'm concerned. So that. And then the radio station, listen, I'm a white Essex soul boy, so it'll be my soul. I don't think it'll be a speech station because if I'm stuck on a desert island, I don't think I want to hear all the bad news going on all the time. So I think I would just want to hear some great, slightly cheesy soul tunes.
Well, Steve Ackerman, thanks so much for being a guest on Here Comes Pod. It's been a fascinating insight into the content creation world of the past, present, and future. And I've very much learned something else about the importance of video that I'm sure will help Here Comes Pod in the future.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you for the invite. Appreciate it.